Robert Mangino. Great having you here tonight. This morning, I wake up and I'm getting ready to do the hit I do on Wednesday mornings with Larry and John, and I wake up to my alarm being KDKA, and I'm listening, and I am just blown away at what I'm hearing. It's just so hard to believe for the first 10, 15 minutes that there's a stabbing incident at Franklin Regional, and it's involving upwards of 24 people, and all of a sudden this is something that national news outlets are paying attention to. It's a lead. It's something that international news is paying attention to, and it's happening right here in our own backyard. And then I had to hear Bill Rakoff live on the scene, and how it's his alma mater and right in his neighborhood. And then you realize, oh my goodness, this is so much closer than I ever realized. And then you hear about this young man, the 16-year-old boy, that goes on this attack, and you wonder what happens. What happens to get a young man to do this here or any other attack that's taken place at a school? Is it really possible that somehow you go from everything's wonderful and everything's happy and everything's great, and all of a sudden the guy just loses it? And if you have paid attention all day, and I'm sure many of you have, comments made about Alex. He's a shy kid. Many people thought, well, I never thought he'd do anything like this at all. He comes from a really nice neighborhood, cul-de-sac development, comfortably middle class, and you think, what's going on here? Nobody thought that this individual was capable of something like this. So is it really a situation where somebody could just snap, or were there indicators that people just missed, and we need to do a better job at being able to recognize that? With me in studio tonight is Sam Rosenberg. He's president of Impacts. I had a chance to see Sam on KDKA TV this afternoon, and with a brief interview with Stacy Smith, I'm thinking I got to get him on tonight to talk about this, and he is now with me in studio tonight. Sam, welcome to KDKA. Great to have you on.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Tell us a bit about Impacts and what you do, so that everybody realizes that what you're about to say, there's a reason you have the qualifications to talk about this.
Sure. Impacts is a company that's, we started in 2003, that basically what we do is we do comprehensive full spectrum personal protection training for individuals, corporations, and schools, and we do this nationwide. So when we talk about personal protection training, it spans not only the physical aspects, but also the preventative aspects. Mm-hmm. So in terms of understanding violence at its root causes, understanding how to predict it, prevent it, and respond to it, on an institutional basis. So, some of our clients are schools, quite a few of them, in fact, and it's something that we've been doing for the past decade. So well before Sandy Hook, we've been actively involved in teaching teachers how to respond to these situations, and more importantly, how to identify the early warning indicators and be able to be literally the eyes and ears of the school to identify these folks before they go off, because they never just snap.
They don't.
They don't. That's a myth. When we start to label these things as random, in another senseless or random act of violence, what we're literally doing is we're abdicating any kind of personal responsibility that we have to be able to predict and prevent these things at their root. If we really start to say something's, unpredictable or random, what we're really saying is that there's nothing anyone can do about it. Bad people are going to do bad things, and it's just going to happen. Mm-hmm. The reality, though, is that in most incidences of workplace violence, I'm talking the vast, overwhelming majority, and in almost 100% of the situations of school violence, we know that the bad guy in this case always telegraphs their intentions. It's not just something where one day, as you said, they're kind of going along and then the next day they go off. There's a descent, and there are very predictable dynamics that people can identify, both on the personality side of the house, if you will, as mm-hmm. well as situational causes, because there are two elements distinctly.
Well, let me bring this up, because all of the neighbors that have been interviewed that I've seen have said they're shocked. Never thought that he was capable of doing something like this. Kids at school, the ones that have been interviewed at least, saying that he was shy, he was pleasant, never saw a mean streak in him. Doesn't all of that contradict what it is that you're saying right now?
Well, it not necessarily, because we don't have the full picture by any means. Okay. We don't have nearly any of the information yet. I think what we're going to see here quite clearly is that the instigating elements here are going to be very, very similar to what we've seen out of the 500 some odd school shootings, multiple homicide school shootings that we've seen since 1993. Okay, we're not talking about what we call in the industry black swan events here, a significant event that comes out of nowhere that nobody could have predicted. The Secret Service has done studies on these things. Mm-hmm. The FBI has done studies on them. Lots of private sector organizations have done studies. The facts are relatively clear in that there are always indicators. What we don't know right now are what those indicators were from the people around him. Most of the time, the unremarkableness, if you will, of the perpetrator is in itself remarkable to most people. People look at these people and they say, well, how could this kid who is a shy, kind of, a reserved young man who was never in trouble with the law, how could he suddenly commit such an atrocity? And the reality is that the typical prototype of these folks, the prototypical character of them is that they are unremarkable. They're not really great looking. They're not really ugly. They're not really social butterflies. They're somewhat alienated. They're bullied, but, they seem to have other outlets. There's all these things. Now, there are some very predictable dynamics. If you'd like me to get into them, I will.
Please.
So, when we start to look at things, first and foremost, I always look at it in two very specific cases or categories, okay? The first that we look at are the personality dynamics. And when I say personality dynamics, what you're talking about is basically a sense of personal responsibility. When it comes to personal responsibility, Mangino, what you're looking at is, on the one hand, for example, someone who takes too little responsibility, in a nutshell, is kind of moving in the neurotic side of the scale. Someone who takes too much responsibility is moving in the neurotic side of the scale. Someone who takes too little responsibility, who doesn't see any personal responsibility of their actions, starts to move into the character disordered side of the scale. Now, this is a very, very simplistic way of looking at things in terms of a very quick understanding, is that someone who slips too far down the neurotic side is more at risk of suicide in many ways, because what happens is their worldview changes to a sense of hopelessness. The reason why I'm not having more success is because I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not this, I'm not that. So there's one type of issue here on this side of the scale. On the other side of the scale, you have someone whose worldview basically says, the reason why I'm not more successful is because you're holding me back. You're against me. The world is against me. And you start to get into this dynamic where you get paranoia, you get a sense of rage, these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these children, these young people who commit these acts, are not as outlandish and flamboyant in their demonstrations of their character disorder as, say, the Columbine killers, wearing dark trench coats and really skylining themselves. Sometimes they are very quiet children, and they're the last person anyone would think, but they were nonetheless hurting and nonetheless, being bullied or ostracized to the point where they felt intense justification in doing something. Then justification is not alone. They start to look at no alternatives to violence as an action. So what happens is they start to see themselves as trapped and in a hopeless scenario where they just can't get out, and that the only recourse they have is a violent recourse.
Like an animal backed into a corner.
Very much so.
Do me a favor. Hold on right there. I had to pause for a moment. Sam Rosenberg is my guest. He is president of Impacts, and we're talking about security on a personal level, institutional level, school level, and how events like today, the things leading up to today, could have been seen Now, is it an issue where people are just absolutely failing us, or do we just not know what to look for in large enough numbers of people? We'll talk more about that, too. Sam Rosenberg with us. Your calls are welcome as well. 866-391-1020.
Mangino.
How it's possible to prevent acts like what took place today at Franklin Regional by being able to predict the behavior. Sam saying that there are signs, and the analogy that you gave on TV earlier on KDKA TV 2 is that it's as predictable as watching water and seeing it boiling, that you know it's about to boil, and it's that clear of an indicator. We just don't know what to look for.
That's correct. And, we're picking up where we left off. I mean, if you think about it in the simplest terms, understanding how to wrap our minds around this, the first thing that happens is someone feels an intense justification.
Okay.
There's a grievance, there's something that kicks it off. So in this case, for example, it probably, most likely, statistically speaking, is bullying. Okay. So, and the problem you have is based on the character disorders that I was explaining before. The grievance may very well be only in the person's mind. They may literally have a degree of psychological disorder that makes it such that a normal person looks at it and goes, why are you so upset about this? But to them, it's the world. So the problem you have is when they start to go from a grievance to feeling intense justification, then what happens is very often they start to fantasize about the idea of getting vengeance, getting revenge. What changes the difference between why some people stop at the fantasy level, which almost all of us have a tendency to do. We sort of, someone upsets you and you have this image in your mind of whatever, but the idea is that most normal people stop at that level, and what decisively changes it is the situational elements. So if there are other factors in that person's life that are positive, things that could keep this kid grounded or outlets that were positive, a lot of times they won't progress to seeing no alternatives. The thing is that when they see no alternatives and they see, as a result, the consequences of their actions actually possibly being positive, where, going to jail and people hearing his manifesto or his story of why he's so upset and analyzing it in this particular context could seem like a positive consequence, or the consequences are meaningless. They've made a decision to commit an atrocity and they don't care what the consequences are. So what happens is now you can start to see where someone goes from those steps of justification to tunneling, having no alternatives, to, having no care or positive sense of consequences, all the way down to seeking the ability. And in this case, I made a postulation that, why did he use a knife? Well, that was one of the questions I was asked several times today by the media. It's quite possible that he just couldn't get easy access to a firearm. It's also quite possible that he was doing a copycat type of attack, predicated on this TV show that played last week. The Following was a TV show that I heard by one of my associates. Had an episode last week where basically one of the things that went on was a mass stabbing. So you have a direct copycat effect, which we know is a causational factor. And lastly, the thing is that mass stabbings are not something new. They're simply something relatively of an anomaly here in the United States, simply because guns are easily available. But mass stabbings occur on massive scales in other countries and other parts of the world. And, with very drastic results, as we've seen.
So it's quite possible that he just didn't have access to the firearms that he would have wanted the firearms, just couldn't get to them.
Quite possible. And a lot of people, I've heard this numerous times, and I'll just interject this at this point, if you don't mind, Mangino, about the metal detectors, okay? How come the school didn't have metal detectors? I don't even know for, one slightest reason why the school may or may not have chosen to have metal detectors, or why they ruled it out or whatever. There's so many logistical concerns there, but I want to put it into context. Just the fact that you have metal detectors does not mean that it's going to stop someone from walking straight right through the metal detector with a weapon and starting to attack people. You know, it's definitely a potential preventative measure. It's definitely a deterrent. It's definitely a tool in the continuum of security. But let's not get hung up on that.
Right.
What we need to be focusing on is how to identify these folks, and more importantly, how to take the oxygen out of the fire. And the oxygen that feeds the fire of all of these types of attacks is the dynamic of notoriety. You see, what they're looking for at the end of the day is they're mad and they want everyone to know about it. And very often with a kid who's as disturbed as someone who could do this act, they've descended down this path where they see no real alternatives, and they're hanging out on what I call the precipice. And a precipitating event like this TV show or another act of bullying or some kind of rebuke from someone could literally set the person into motion. And this is the outcome.
It's been reported today that there was a phone call that may have been made last night where he exchanged with another person who was supposed to be the victim, and the reports are that he didn't come to school today. Should there have been more done in light of that? Is that one of those things to where, okay, not only do I not go, but a phone call needs to be made to alert people of this, or are we putting too much pressure, too much of a burden on one individual?
One of the critical pre-incident indicators of almost all these attacks is the presence of threats. Okay, or the carrying of a weapon into school, or the showing of a weapon to another student prior to an attack. In many cases, the pre-incident indicator of those kinds of behaviors are almost like in a suicide, a cry for help. You know, they want someone to intervene. They want someone to say, you know, okay, what's going on here? How do we interrupt this process? The thing is that, you know, saying that someone got a threat and didn't respond to it accurately, it's kind of like looking at TSA, right? TSA says, if you see something, say something. The problem is no one's telling you what the hell to look for. So, you know, the reality here is that the society as a whole needs to be educated as to what these warning indicators are and what to do about it.
Sam Rosenberg is with us. He is president of Impacts, and we're talking about school security. With all that happened today, what can we do moving forward? What can be done? Is there anything that can be done? And it seems as though there is. And we'll get to your calls coming up. More with Sam moments away right after news headlines. News Radio 1020, KDKA. I'm Mangino. Sam Rosenberg is my guest. What to do? Is there anything that you can do to prevent acts like this from occurring today, or are we just victims of where people just go off the deep end and just lose it, and there's nothing we can do about it? We just happen to be going through life and hope it doesn't happen to us. We'll talk more with Sam about this. We'll get to your phone calls, 866-391-1020, Dollar Bank Instant Access at KDKA.com. We are talking about the knife attack at Franklin Regional. Upwards of 24 people injured in this attack. And our guest this hour is Sam Rosenberg. He is president of Impacts, and Sam specializes in training individuals, institutions, including schools, on how to recognize potential threats and how to prevent events like this from being able to occur. And we're talking about, obviously, what's happening today. We'll get to your phone calls, 866-391-1020, 866-391-1020. But for those people who are just joining us now, you firmly believe that there were indicators that people, if they were properly trained, would have been able to pick up on and maybe be able to prevent the incident from occurring today that took place at Franklin Regional. Is that true?
I believe so. And what I said to you, you know, on the break earlier was that, you know, we don't have all the information by any means at this point. But what I firmly believe is as the information starts to unfold, that we're going to start to see very similar patterns in this incident to almost all of the other incidents that have occurred over the years. And we're going to start to see the same elements. You know, it's not just my theory on this. There was a number of studies. I'll reference reference a couple of them, but there was one in particular, a Secret Service study that was done, and it was published, I believe, in 2003. So the data set was 1993 to 2003, that 10-year period where the whole dynamic, the whole phenomena of school violence was really or really not just school violence, but school homicide, mass homicides was taking hold and ramping. And one of the things that they basically said was one of their key findings was that bad guys, the perpetrators of these issues, always telegraph their actions, nearly always. And they do it in relatively observable and easily identifiable ways. The problem is most people are just not paying attention to it. And again, it's not that people can divine these things out of thin air. You have to be looking for it. And it's not just anybody. It's generally the people around them. You know, I'll be surprised if other students who knew this kid will not come forward and say, you know what, yeah, he was someone that disturbed us. Maybe they never thought he could do something like this, but that he disturbed them in some way, that intuitively, you know, knowing without knowing why, at their young age and their young experience level, they still intuitively understood that this person was troubled and potentially dangerous.
Does there need to be a greater willingness or a way of encouraging people to come forward to express that intuitive feeling that they have to a teacher, to an administrator, to a guidance counselor, to somebody?
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the best ways to do that I've seen work in the schools, and the process of school security is a multifaceted approach. I'm one element of the puzzle. In fact, our element of the puzzle, just so you understand it, is not just on the prevention side, but also on the extreme end, the response side, is teaching teachers what do you do in the event a situation kicks off. So, you know, that's the void where all the damage is occurring between the actual moment of attack recognition or intruder alert to law enforcement response time. And that void needs to be filled. And the reason why, so you understand my perspective, Mangino, is that I believe you must teach people how to swim. The professional lifeguards are going to be out there, but they're not going to be there in the moment of truth. You have to know how to swim. So the idea here is that prevention is a critical component, and understanding these indicators is critical. Response is also a critical component, because even though you may have very heightened prevention skills, if you don't have a lot of contact with that person, that perpetrator, you may not see it coming, and it may still go off in such a way that you have to respond.
So the idea of running away and knowing where to go to run away, like pulling the fire alarm, good move. The idea of teachers hiding children in the classroom and locking the doors, good move. But another aspect of the training, what I'm hearing you say, is that teachers, adults in the situations, need to not only know how to usher them out and then hide them, but how to engage the individual when they have that opportunity in front of them.
Yeah, when there's no other alternative. Because there's no question, if you can run, you run. All right, you try to distance yourself from the situation. If you can't, then you want to try and delay contact as long as possible. So we know that lockdowns work. We know that preventing the bad guy from getting access to you and your children is critical. And if you give the cops more time to get there, they're going to get there. But should that teacher come face to face with an armed intruder, you know, you have to be able to take action. That's exactly what we saw here today, even out of people who don't have training. You know, in fact, even in shootings, most people don't think you have a chance. But the hard statistics right now is that 20% of the time, the perpetrators in multiple homicide shootings are being brought down by ordinary citizens with no training. So imagine what you can do if you have professional training. That's what our organization does. We're the only organization in the country that I know of that actually teaches teachers what to do in that void between intruder alert and law enforcement response should they come face to face with an armed attacker, whether it's a knife or a gun.
Well, we've been talking a lot about one of the issues that was brought up today is that no metal detectors at the school. And a lot of talk about how there were video cameras, a lot of video cameras at the school. And you got to wonder, with all the money spent on all the video cameras and all the technology that was there, that didn't prevent it from happening. Are we expecting too much out of what we're choosing to use when it comes to security measures?
Well, let's go back in time a step, okay? There were video cameras in Columbine, right? There are video cameras in a lot of the schools where school shootings have occurred. In Columbine, the killers knew exactly where the video cameras were. So what do you think what role did the cameras play in the incident? It was the vehicle, for all intents and purposes, of where they wanted to commit the atrocities the most so that they would be caught on tape and have that degree of potential notoriety. Video cameras are an essential component of a security continuum, but unfortunately in these situations they have no ability to legitimately prevent an incident from going off. They can help in some cases to expedite response, but even that I think is going to be very limited. As you saw the chaos of what was going on there, the video cameras would not have helped overly much. The issue of metal detectors, what I sense here, unfortunately, is everybody looking for someone to blame. And what they're looking to blame it on is the school district, and is pointing the finger and saying there were no metal detectors. How come they didn't have metal detectors? As if that would have stopped someone from walking straight through the metal detector with a weapon and commencing an attack. You know, the metal detectors, again, I personally think are an excellent resource and an excellent electronic component in any security continuum, and I would have no problem with metal detectors in my schools of my kids. You know, the reality is that we have to understand what potential role that plays, and we can't assume that it's going to keep us safe totally. You know, these things are just elements of a multifaceted continuum. You know, my expertise are nothing but one element of a continuum. I work hand in hand with experts like Lou Gentile and John Hudson. I work hand in hand on the bully prevention side with awesome companies like Tyversa. You know, that people who are on the leading edge of these things. And, you know, we just fill one aspect of that.
Right. And anybody looking for one issue to be the solution, they're looking at it wrong, aren't they?
Absolutely. It has to be a holistic, multifaceted approach. And functionally speaking, it's different from campus to campus. You have to look at it from each campus's perspective.
John in Pittsburgh, good evening. You're on KDKA. Hey, John.
Yes.
You're on the air, pal.
Awesome. How are you doing tonight, sir?
Doing well. What do you think?
Well, I didn't know if I would get on or not, but just wanted to say I'm actually a youth leader at a church and a parent of teens. And what I wanted to share was I totally agree with everything that Mr. Rosenberg has been saying. Awesome. You know, awesome background and training.
Thank you, John.
But what I wanted to do is just approach it from a different aspect, which I'm sure he'll agree with, is we need to win the hearts of our youth back. When it all comes down to it, getting to their hearts, because that's what I work with every day. And I think it takes getting back to basics in our society, getting the families, churches, schools, everybody working together. I work with teens every week. And they are really hurting. And it doesn't matter if they have great backgrounds, if they're rich, if they're talented, if they have the best looks in the world. These youth are still hurting these days.
John,
and what I find... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, you're absolutely right on so many levels. And one of the things I always try and tell people is, like I said, the victims sometimes, very often, become the victimizers. And a lot of times all it takes is someone like you who's a coach, someone who's a youth leader, to show an interest in them, demonstrate to them that they're valuable, that they have someone who cares about them, and that sometimes is all it takes to change someone's course from seeing no alternatives to having alternatives.
That's right. Yeah, I agree totally. And, you know, everybody just keeping their eyes and ears open. And, you know, I'm kind of going to go a little old school here, but I really think that we need to get back to values, the old school values of our country, you know, and when these youth have a spiritual foundation, I've seen it time and time again. I've seen youth that have threatened their own lives, that are doing cutting, that are hurting others, that are lashing out in anger, that are hiding things. And, when you start to help them form a spiritual foundation, it changes everything. And I think there is real evil in the world today, and there is real good. And I think we need to just go back to basics as parents. And just everybody wake up and talk to our kids and understand them and look for those signs, like you said, and catch these things as early as we can. Because a young teen that is filled, that has a heart that is in good shape, you know what I mean, is not going to go out and go down a road, because I believe that you have to go down a road to get to this point to do something like this. I think maybe rarely, you could just snap, but I really believe it's a chain of events that occurs in their life where they get to that point where there's no way out. You see it.
John, fantastic points. But what's interesting to me, Sam, is that bullying is not brand new. Bullying has been around for as long as there have been people, right? But there's something different about the way young people are handling the issue of bullying. There's something that we have lost. And I think maybe John hit on something in that we're somehow not playing the right role as parents, as families, as churches, to give these kids the ability to withstand the bullying that generations ago they were able to handle.
What you have is it's a lack of resilience, okay?
Okay.
And resilience is not even a good enough word to define it, because what I'm talking about comes down to also this sense of responsibility that we talked about. We live in a very bizarre culture right now where our young people all want to be celebrities but have no idea what they want to do to try and achieve that. So they don't look at things and say, I want to be a musician for the sake of music, and if celebrityhood finds me, great. I still just want to be a musician. They just want to be famous. We see this with the YouTube culture. We see this in incidences where there's incidences of violence where instead of children having a normal response to violence, they whip out their cameras and start to videotape it to put it on YouTube. This dynamic of intense desensitization that we have subjected our generations of children to through media violence, through video game violence, has completely changed their fabric. When you couple that with this essentially digital, virtual culture where everybody wants to be famous, everybody wants, to be a billionaire. Nobody recognizes the value of personal responsibility. We've got real problems in that way. I'll give you a perfect story. Okay?
Do me a favor.
Sure.
I want to hear the perfect story, but my clock is saying I have to pause for a moment.
No
Sam
problem.
Rosenberg is with us. He is president of Impacts. We'll get to more of your calls coming up. I'm Mangino. Sam Rosenberg is with me in studio. He is president of Impacts, and we're talking about the tragic stabbings today at Franklin Regional and getting some insights. Impacts specializes in helping to prevent and predict criminal behavior in institutional settings like businesses and corporations and schools, and helping to train individuals to be able to respond to these incidents as well, whether they be armed or unarmed. And Sam, we were talking during the break about where culture is today, where it was, and how we think that we can get away with going in this direction, and we don't fully recognize or appreciate what we're doing to damage our own kids in the process.
Well, let me put it to you this way, okay? This whole dynamic of school violence in many ways started. Now, we'd had incidences prior to this, but they were generally what we would call black swan events. There were one-offs that really you had no frame of reference on. They came out of nowhere. But in about 1993, we started to see this phenomena increased dramatically, almost as a very specific trend. And there were notable similarities from case to case. And the thing is, when you go back in time and say, well, what happened in our society back in the early 90s? We had this massive information boom, computers, the internet, cell phones, video games. And things like violence in the media increased dramatically. As we were talking in the break, in the 80s, you'd see the most violent thing on TV was the A-Team, where Mr. T would throw someone on a box of mattresses or something. No one ever got hurt. No one ever got killed. You would never have someone depicting a mass stabbing at a bookstore or whatnot on television with full gore and Hollywood-like reality. And we have children, generations of children who have been weaned on this now. And most importantly to me is really not just the violence we see on television, but the violence we see in video games. It is functionally what we call pathological play. So you get a kid who's sort of socially isolated, and he needs an outlet. He's stressed and he needs an outlet, and he turns to violent video games, these first-person shooter games. And to put this into perspective, back in the early 90s, the Marine Corps, I was a Marine officer back then, and we noticed that the Marine Corps has always been cutting edge when it comes to combat training. And what they did was they looked at it and said, these first-person shooter games like Quake and Doom, these things aren't games. They're actual combat trainers. They elicit a visceral reaction out of the player that's an adrenaline response very similar to the way a combat aviator would get the same kind of stimuli out of an aviation simulator. And they started putting these in the barracks. And the reason was to intensely desensitize people to violence. Now, the thing is, the games today are so much more intensive, not just the movies and the television, but these games, they're interactive, and they repetitively reinforce the idea of killing and massive destruction on a massive level again and again, and kids play them for thousands of hours. Now, the difference is, it's not pathological when the military uses it, because the military is an environment of intense discipline and personal responsibility. There's major penalties for touching your firearm or pointing it in a direction that it doesn't belong, et cetera, et cetera. There's rules of engagement that are constantly driven home. Now, you take a child who has this underlying psychological problem, whose character disorder to the degree that they don't have a sense of personal responsibility, that has very few situational elements helping them in terms of outlets and friends and coaches like John who called in, or anyone out there looking at them and saying, let's move you into a positive direction. And their primary stress relief is to go into their parents' basement and play violent video games for hours on end, pathologically reinforcing that joy is derived by destruction and violence. And what you have now is a bomb that could be lit, a fuse that could be lit. And when you start to go back to what we started with, of justification and not seeing alternatives to these things and not caring about the consequences. And how can you care about consequence if you don't care about having any personal responsibility, if you don't see any personal connection? Then you can have any kind of incident start to drive someone down this ladder, if you will. And that's when you start looking at all these indicators. You start seeing the threats, and you start seeing the pathological play, and you start seeing all these elements that are evident. Now, unfortunately, most people don't